The midday sun burned softly above the quiet rural town, casting long shadows over the neat rows of mailboxes that lined the country road, each one standing like a sentinel of memory and belonging. But for Sergeant Ethan Walker, freshly discharged from the Marines after 12 relentless years of service, the road home felt both familiar and foreign, as if time itself had layered invisible veils between the man he once was and the man returning now. He walked slowly, his military duffel slung over his shoulder, the weight not nearly as heavy as the silence pressing inside his chest. For though his uniform was neatly folded in the bag, his bearing remained unmistakably that of a Marine. Squared shoulders, disciplined stride, his clean-shaven face bronzed by desert suns, jawline etched with a faint scar he had earned during a night raid in Helmand Province. Eyes a piercing grey that betrayed both exhaustion and vigilance, and every subtle movement of his head revealed the instincts of a soldier who had lived too long in war to ever fully return to peace. As he approached the familiar outline of his childhood home, a white farmhouse with paint peeling along the edges and a porch sagging slightly with age, the air carried the scent of pine and freshly mown grass, a fragrance that stirred bittersweet memories of boyhood summers spent chasing fireflies with his brother and carving initials into oak trees. Yet mingling with that sweetness was a sharp unease, because something about the yard seemed disturbingly wrong. The stillness was not one of peace, but of neglect, a silence where laughter once thrived. And there beneath the oak tree at the edge of the yard, he saw him, his loyal German shepherd, Duke, chained to the trunk like a discarded object, ribs faintly visible beneath his coarse tan and black fur, head lowered but ears twitching faintly at Ethan's footsteps, and the sight struck him harder than any ambush ever had, a blow straight to the marrow of his being. Duke was no ordinary dog. Ethan remembered the day he first picked him from the litter. A bold pup with sharp eyes and oversized paws, only 6 weeks old but already fearless, bounding toward him as though claiming him by destiny. Duke had grown into a powerful companion, tall and muscular with a thick coat of sable fur, keen amber eyes that glowed with loyalty and a gait proud yet playful, a dog whose presence could disarm Ethan's darkest moods during those brief leaves between deployments. A dog that slept by his boots the night before he shipped out to Afghanistan, whining softly as though sensing the peril his master faced. To see that same noble creature now gaunt, chained, and left to endure the elements was more than heartbreak. It was betrayal, a violation of trust so sacred that Ethan's chest burned with a fury he could scarcely contain. Dropping his bag to the dirt, he strode forward, his boots crunching on gravel, and Duke's ears perked higher, his head lifting slowly, eyes widening with recognition that grew into an explosion of emotion. The dog lunged against the chain, whining, barking hoarsely, tail whipping like a frantic flag of joy and desperation, and Ethan fell to his knees, gathering the massive shepherd into his arms as best he could despite the chain pulling taut between them, whispering broken words. "I'm here, boy. I'm here. I've got you now." His voice thick with rage and sorrow. Tears he hadn't shed in years, sliding hot down his sunburnt face, mingling with the dust of the yard. The sound of footsteps behind him made Ethan spin, instincts primed, hand half reaching for a weapon no longer at his side. But what he saw only deepened the storm inside. His neighbor, Rick Dalton, a stocky man in his late 40s with thinning blonde hair, sunburnt skin, and a permanent smirk that seemed carved into his round face, stood on the porch sipping a can of beer, his belly pressing against a stained white tank top, denim shorts hanging loosely over his thick legs. Rick's eyes carried a smugness that had always grated on Ethan even before the war. The arrogance of a man who had never sacrificed, never served, yet carried himself as if the world owed him respect. And now his expression was one of annoyance rather than guilt. "Oh, you're back," Rick called lazily, waving the beer can like a salute. "Figured they'd keep you over there longer. Dog's been making a racket, so I chained him up." "You're welcome." Ethan's jaw tightened until it ached, every muscle in his body straining against the impulse to storm across the porch and drive his fist into that smug face. But years of discipline restrained him, barely. Instead, he turned his attention back to Duke, fingers working at the rusty padlock on the chain. But it was sealed tight, and he realized with growing rage that Rick hadn't just tied the dog temporarily, he had deliberately imprisoned him. "He's not yours to chain," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous, like the calm before a thunderclap. But Rick only shrugged, sipping his beer again. "Dog kept digging in my garden, chasing my chickens." "Someone had to do something. Your folks left months ago." "I figured no one cared," Ethan froze. His folks, his mother with her gentle laugh, his father with the calloused hands of a lifelong carpenter. They had moved. Why hadn't they told him? A cold knot of confusion joined the fire already raging in his gut. He would find answers, but first he had to free Duke. Rising, he marched to the porch, standing inches from Rick, his towering frame casting a shadow over the shorter man. Ethan's presence was commanding. 6'1" of hardened muscle and military discipline, grey eyes locked with deadly intensity. And even Rick flinched slightly before masking it with a scoff. "Get me the key," Ethan said, voice steady but brimming with threat, and for a moment silence stretched between them, heavy as lead. Rick finally snorted, tossing the key carelessly toward the yard where it clattered against the dirt. "Fine. Take your mutt, don't say I didn't help." Ethan retrieved the key, freed Duke, and the shepherd leapt into his arms fully this time, paws resting against his chest, tongue lashing at his face with unrestrained joy, and Ethan held him, promising silently that never again would his companion know such neglect. Yet beneath that reunion burned a deeper question. Why had his parents left? Why had no one told him? And how had things in this quiet town shifted so cruelly during his absence? With Duke pressed to his side, Ethan vowed to uncover the truth. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. His response to this betrayal, to the suffering of his dog, would be something no one in this town would ever forget. Ethan carried Duke inside the old farmhouse, his boots echoing against the worn wooden floorboards that creaked beneath the weight of both man and dog. The familiar scent of dust and aged timber mingling with faint traces of his mother's lavender cleaner still clinging stubbornly to the air like ghosts of a home once warm and welcoming. But as he stepped through the rooms he had not seen in years, what he found instead of comfort was vacancy. Picture frames that once held family photographs had been stripped from the walls. Furniture was covered in thin sheets of dust, and the silence was so heavy it seemed to smother the very essence of memory, making every step feel like trespassing in a place that had once belonged wholly to love. Duke padded beside him, tail wagging tentatively, his body pressing close as though unwilling to be separated again, and Ethan's hand rested naturally on the shepherd's back, fingers stroking through coarse fur. But the closer he looked, the more anger filled him. The rawness of Duke's rib cage, the sores on his neck where the chain had rubbed skin raw, the dullness in eyes that had once gleamed with mischief and vitality. Someone had not only chained his dog, but had left him hungry and thirsty for far too long. And Ethan could not shake the thought that if he had been delayed even a few weeks more, he might have returned to find only a grave beneath that oak tree. Sitting heavily on the old sofa, he pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolling through old messages, his thumb pausing on the last voicemail from his mother, a gentle voice filled with pride for her marine son, recorded nearly 8 months ago. Yet there had been nothing since, and the realization struck harder than gunfire. His parents had left this house behind without telling him where they had gone, leaving Duke at the mercy of indifferent neighbors and a community that clearly had not cared enough to intervene. His jaw tightened as memories of Rick Dalton's smirk flashed in his mind. The man had always been trouble, known around town for cutting corners on his small construction business, often found drunk at midday, his temper sharp when provoked, but even Rick's selfishness did not explain the town's silence. Ethan rose, determined to find answers, and Duke followed closely, nails clicking against the floorboards as they stepped back into the daylight, where the small town stretched in the distance, church steeple rising above rooftops, the gas station, the diner, all the familiar landmarks of a community Ethan had once known, like the lines of his own palm. Yet now it felt like enemy territory, every shadow filled with suspicion. The first person he encountered was Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her 60s with short grey curls, round glasses perched on her nose, and a floral dress that fluttered in the breeze as she watered flowers in her front yard. She had once baked pies for Ethan when he was a boy, always greeting him with a warm smile, but today her eyes widened at the sight of him, then darted quickly away as though guilty. "Mrs. Thompson?" Ethan called, voice firm but not unkind, Duke padding by his side with ears perked. She hesitated before turning, clutching the watering can like a shield. "Ethan, you're home." Her voice carried surprise tinged with unease. He stepped closer, grey eyes searching her face. "Where are my parents? Why is my dog half-starved and chained to a tree?" The questions fell like stones, and Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the street as though afraid someone might see. "Your folks? They left town months back. Said it was for the best. Sold the place to the bank." I thought you knew. Ethan's chest tightened. "For the best? What does that mean?" But before she could answer, a sharp voice cut across the yard. "Leave him be, Martha." Rick Dalton again, swaggering down the sidewalk with another beer in hand, his grin insolent. "The Walker boy's back. Thinks he can demand answers like he's still barking orders overseas." Ethan turned slowly, his presence a coiled spring, and Rick smirked wider. "Your folks didn't belong here anymore. Too much debt. House wasn't theirs to keep. As for the mutt, I did what I had to. Be grateful I didn't send him to the pound." Duke growled low, the sound vibrating deep in his chest, ears flattened and eyes locked on the man who had caused him so much suffering. Ethan placed a calming hand on the dog's head, but his own fury was barely contained. "You call starving and chaining a living being help?" His voice cut like a blade. Rick sneered. "Better than letting him tear up property. This town's not what it used to be, Walker. Folks mind their own business now. You'd do well to do the same." With that, he sauntered off, leaving silence behind, broken only by the sound of Duke's laboured breathing. Mrs. Thompson lowered her eyes, ashamed. "Things have been hard here, Ethan. People, they've changed." Ethan stood there, fists clenched, and knew this was only the beginning. Something darker had settled over his hometown, something that went beyond neglect and petty cruelty, and it had touched his family, driven them away, left his dog to suffer. He looked down at Duke, who gazed up at him with unwavering trust, and he swore then and there that he would uncover every truth buried beneath this town's silence, no matter who stood in his way. Ethan rose early the next morning, though sleep had barely touched him, haunted as he was by half-forgotten memories of his parents at the kitchen table, his father's steady laugh, his mother's gentle hand brushing crumbs from his plate, all those simple rituals of love that now seemed stolen by some invisible hand. And as he brewed coffee in the dusty old pot, Duke lay stretched across the floorboards, ribs rising and falling with a steady rhythm, eyes half open, as though unwilling to surrender entirely to rest, as if afraid that his master might vanish again the way he had so many times before. Ethan crouched down, running a hand through the dog's thick fur, whispering, "Not anymore, boy. I'm here now. We're in this together." And Duke's tail thumped weakly in response, a small sound, but enough to fortify Ethan's resolve. Stepping outside, mug in hand, he scanned the horizon of the small town spread beyond the fences, a place once defined by community picnics, baseball games, and church bells on Sundays, now marked by an eerie quiet, shutters closed, neighbours avoiding eye contact as they hurried past. It was as though the very soul of the town had been hollowed out, leaving behind only suspicion and fear. Determined to seek answers, Ethan made his way to the diner at the corner of Main Street, its neon sign flickering weakly in the daylight, the smell of bacon and burnt coffee wafting out as he pushed through the door, the bell above chiming a familiar note that struck a chord deep in his chest. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few locals hunched over their plates, but behind the counter stood Clara Jensen, a woman in her early 40s with auburn hair tied back in a bun, fair skin, and a figure both sturdy and graceful, her green eyes sharp but weary. The kind of woman who carried the weight of responsibility on her shoulders without complaint. Clara had been a high school classmate of Ethan's, once known for her quick wit and kindness. And when she looked up to see him, her eyes widened with recognition, then softened into something between relief and sorrow. "Ethan Walker," she said, voice low but warm. "You're back." He slid onto a stool, Duke settling at his feet, earning a few wary glances from other patrons. "Back, but not sure what I've come home to," Ethan replied, his gaze steady. "Where are my parents, Clara? Why was my dog left chained to a tree like garbage?" Clara hesitated, glancing at the others in the diner who quickly buried themselves in their meals, pretending not to listen though their ears strained for every word. Leaning closer, she whispered, "Your parents didn't want to leave, Ethan. They were forced. Bank foreclosed on the farm after some debts piled up. Debts I swear your father didn't owe. People around here, they've been pressured. Rick Dalton's been working with some men from outside town, developers who've got their eyes on this land. Your folks resisted, and it got ugly." Ethan's jaw tightened, his hand clenching around the mug until he feared it might crack. "Ugly how?" Clara's eyes darkened. "Threats. Harassment. One night your dad's truck was set on fire in the driveway. A week later, they packed up and left. Said they'd call once they were safe, but I haven't heard from them since." The room seemed to tilt, rage boiling in Ethan's veins, the Marine inside him roaring to life. He glanced down at Duke, whose ears twitched, sensing his master's turmoil. And no one stepped in? No one tried to stop this? Clara's voice broke slightly. "People are scared, Ethan. These men, they don't play by rules. Sheriff's hands are tied, or maybe he's on their payroll no one knows anymore. Folks keep their heads down, hoping not to be next." Ethan leaned back, his presence commanding even in stillness, his grey eyes sweeping the diner. "Fear is no excuse for betrayal," he said, his voice carrying enough weight to draw the stares of those who had tried to hide their listening. One of the men at the back, tall and lean with a trucker's cap pulled low over his brow, muttered, "You think wearing that uniform once makes you better than the rest of us? Times changed, Walker. Best you don't stir up what you can't finish." Ethan turned his head slowly, pinning the man with a gaze honed on battlefields where hesitation meant death. "The difference," he said evenly, "is that I finish what I start." The man looked away first, shifting uncomfortably, and silence fell heavy again until Clara refilled Ethan's coffee, her hand trembling slightly. Leaving the diner, Ethan walked down Main Street, Duke pacing beside him with renewed energy, as though sensing purpose. Storefronts stood half empty, many with "for sale" signs taped to windows, the life of the town bleeding away one property at a time. And Ethan knew then that this was bigger than his family's misfortune. It was a systematic erosion, an invasion disguised as business. His parents had been driven out, his dog neglected, and his community cowed into silence, but he was not a man easily silenced. Later that afternoon, he visited the sheriff's office, a squat brick building with peeling paint, where Sheriff Donnelly, a man in his late 50s with thinning grey hair, a clean-shaven face, and a stocky frame softened by years of desk work, greeted him with forced cheer that did not reach his tired blue eyes. "Sergeant Walker," Donnelly said, extending a hand that Ethan shook firmly. "Heard you were back. Sorry about your folks. Times have been rough." Ethan sat across from him, Duke lying at his boots like a sentinel. "Rough doesn't explain chains around my dog's neck or arson against my father's truck," Ethan said coldly. Donnelly sighed, leaning back in his chair, the leather creaking. "Look, son, there are things at play here that I can't control. Developers bring money. Folks like Dalton, they get emboldened. Best thing you can do is let it be." Ethan's laugh was humorless, sharp as broken glass. "Let it be? You think I fought halfway across the world to come home and watch bullies and cowards strip my town bare? No, Sheriff. I won't let it be. Donnelly's eyes flickered, a mix of shame and resignation. Then watch your back, he muttered. That night, as Ethan sat on the porch of the farmhouse, Duke's head resting in his lap, he felt the weight of silence pressing from all directions, but beneath that weight was a spark of defiance growing into flame. The town may have forgotten what it meant to stand tall, but Ethan hadn't, and neither had Duke. Together, man and dog would peel back every shadow, expose every betrayal, and reclaim what was theirs. The next evening, as dusk bled across the horizon and shadows stretched long over the quiet fields, Ethan sat sharpening the old hunting knife his father had left behind, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone echoing softly through the farmhouse, Duke lying nearby with ears perked, ever alert. The silence was tense, charged with unspoken awareness that their presence had not gone unnoticed since his return, and Ethan's instincts, those sharpened by a dozen battlefields, told him eyes were watching from the tree line beyond the yard. Sure enough, when he stepped out onto the porch, grey eyes scanning the dusky distance, he caught the faint glint of headlights, killing their glow in the distance. A truck idling before easing slowly down the road, and his jaw clenched because it confirmed what Clara had warned him. The men behind Dalton already knew he was back, and they were measuring him. He refused to be measured like cattle. Strapping Duke's leash, though the shepherd hardly needed restraint, Ethan moved into town that night, boots crunching gravel as he followed the main road toward Dalton's property, where rumours claimed the developers gathered after hours, planning their slow strangulation of the town. Rick Dalton's house sat on the edge of a field, larger than Ethan remembered, freshly painted with new siding that gleamed in the moonlight, paid for, no doubt, by the pockets of outsiders who wanted the land. But what caught Ethan's eye was the cluster of vehicles parked out front. Black SUVs with tinted windows, a pair of trucks, and men standing in the yard smoking cigarettes, silhouettes broad and purposeful. Duke tensed, hackles rising, a low growl vibrating from his chest, and Ethan placed a steadying hand on his fur. "Easy, boy," he whispered, crouching low behind the cover of a hedge as he listened. Voices carried across the night. Rough laughter mingled with sharp commands. One voice, deeper than the rest, carried authority. "Dalton, you keep the pressure on." Folks like the Walkers are examples. Once they're gone, the others will fold. Rick's nasal laugh followed. "Well, the Marine's back now, but don't worry, I'll handle him." "He doesn't scare me." Ethan felt Duke stiffen, the dog's amber eyes locked on the man who had chained and starved him. And in that moment, Ethan shared the same fire. War had taught him patience, but it had also taught him that when the enemy names you as an obstacle, you strike before they strike you. He waited until the meeting inside shifted, the men retreating into Dalton's house before moving silently toward the porch. Duke at his side, every step careful, measured, his body moving with the ease of combat readiness. He wasn't there to kill, not yet, but to gather proof, to know who he was up against. Through the cracked blinds, he glimpsed three strangers inside, all sharp suits despite the rural setting, their faces clean-shaven, hair slicked, the look of corporate predators who cloaked violence in contracts. One of them, tall with a square jaw and cold blue eyes, flipped open a folder of deeds, parcels of land marked in red ink. Ethan's stomach turned as he spotted his parents' farm circled boldly. Proof, he thought, clenching his fists. Proof that this was theft disguised as business. But then the door opened suddenly, light spilling onto the porch, and Ethan barely pulled back into shadow as Rick stepped out, phone pressed to his ear, muttering angrily about the damn dog still being around. Duke growled low, a sound Ethan silenced with a touch. But Rick froze, glancing toward the darkness. "Who's there?" he barked, stepping off the porch, Beerbelly leading the way, his arrogance unshaken. Ethan waited, letting him come closer until their faces were only feet apart in the dark. And then he rose, towering, grey eyes glinting like steel. Rick stumbled back, startled. "You..." But Ethan's hand shot out, grabbing the front of his shirt, dragging him close with the strength of a man forged by war. "Listen carefully," Ethan growled, his voice low and deadly calm. "If you ever lay a hand on my dog again, if you so much as breathe wrong in his direction, you'll beg to be back in the days when chaining him to a tree was your worst mistake." Rick's breath stank of alcohol as he stammered, You don't know who you're messing with. These men—" Ethan shoved him hard against the porch post, cutting him off. "I know enough, and I'm not afraid of men who hide behind contracts and cowards." With that, he released him, letting Rick collapse to the ground, and turned away, Duke pressing close as they melted back into the night. But retaliation came swiftly. The next morning, Ethan woke to the crack of glass, Duke barking furiously as a brick smashed through the farmhouse window. A crude message scrawled across it in black paint. "Leave or else." Ethan picked up the brick, jaw tight. But when he looked down at Duke, panting, alert, unafraid, something inside him steadied. He was not just fighting for land or pride. He was fighting for loyalty, for the bond that had carried him through war, and now through betrayal. Later that day, Clara came by, her expression strained as she handed him a folded paper slipped under the diner door. It was a notice, official looking, claiming the farm was condemned, slated for demolition within weeks. "They're moving fast," she whispered, fear in her green eyes. Ethan studied the notice, then looked out across the fields where his father had toiled, where Duke had once run free, and where shadows now crept like a disease. "Then we move faster," he said, his voice iron. That night, he sat again on the porch, Duke's head resting heavily against his knee, the stars scattered across the sky like distant fires. Ethan remembered nights overseas when he wondered if he'd ever make it home. And now that he was here, home itself was under siege. But he was no stranger to sieges. If these men thought he would walk away quietly, they had underestimated not just the Marine in him, but the man whose loyalty to those he loved was unbreakable. As the crickets sang and Duke's breathing steadied, Ethan's eyes narrowed on the darkness beyond the fields, and he whispered, "This is our fight now, boy, and we don't lose." The storm arrived, not with thunder in the skies, but with boots on the ground, the kind of storm Ethan had learned to recognize long before it broke, when silence in the air was too sharp and the world seemed to hold its breath. He felt it that evening as he cleaned Duke's wounds more thoroughly, rubbing salve into the sores around his neck where the chain had bitten deep. The shepherd wincing but staying still, his amber eyes burning with the same resilience that carried Ethan through nights of mortar fire. And when Duke licked his master's hand as if to say he was ready for whatever came next, Ethan knew the fight would not wait. At dusk, engines growled at the edge of the driveway, headlights spilling across the field like intruders' eyes. And from the porch, Ethan watched as 3 black SUVs rolled to a stop, doors opening in sync, and men stepped out with the polished efficiency of wolves, not townsfolk, but outsiders in dark suits and heavy boots, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, each one radiating the casual menace of those who believed the law was on their payroll. Rick Dalton emerged from the lead vehicle, swagger unshaken, his smirk wider now with backup behind him, and he raised his beer can in mock salute. "Evening, Marine. Thought we'd pay a visit, see if you're as tough at home as you were overseas." Duke growled low, body coiled, teeth bared in the glow of the porch light, and Ethan rested a calming hand on his fur, though his own blood surged with battle-born adrenaline. He stepped down the porch, unflinching as the men fanned out, their leader, a tall man with cold blue eyes, the same one Ethan had glimpsed in Dalton's house, smiling thinly. "Sergeant Walker," the man said, voice smooth as glass but edged with threat. "You're standing in the way of progress. This land belongs to us now. Best you pack up before things turn unpleasant." Ethan's grey eyes locked with his, steady as iron. "This land belonged to my father, before you ever laid eyes on it, and it'll belong to my family after you're gone. You want me out? You'll have to drag me." The man chuckled, signaling subtly, and 2 of his men stepped forward, one reaching for Duke's leash. That was the mistake. Duke exploded forward with the precision of training born from instinct, jaws snapping onto the man's arm, dragging him down with a force that sent gravel scattering. And in the same instant, Ethan moved, faster than the suits expected, slamming his shoulder into the second man's chest, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The yard erupted in chaos, shouts, curses, fists flying, Duke snarling as he held his ground. Rick Dalton stumbled back, shouting, "Get him under control!" But his words were drowned by the crack of Ethan's fist against another jaw. Years of combat discipline unleashed not with rifles, but with the raw fury of a man defending home and loyalty. One of the men drew a baton, swinging toward Ethan's ribs, but Duke lunged, intercepting, his teeth tearing into the man's leg, forcing him to drop the weapon with a scream. Ethan grabbed the baton mid-fall, spinning it with trained efficiency before cracking it across another attacker's shoulder, sending him collapsing to the ground. For a moment, the yard became a battlefield, the farmhouse lit by headlights, dust rising like smoke, men groaning in pain while the Marine and his shepherd stood unbroken at the center. The leader stepped forward at last, calm even as his men faltered, pulling a sleek pistol from beneath his jacket. The metallic click as he chambered a round cut through the noise, and silence fell heavy as he leveled it at Ethan's chest. "Enough," he said coldly. "You've made your point. But I don't lose. Walk away now, and maybe your dog walks away too." Duke growled deeper, poised to strike, and Ethan raised a hand subtly, signaling him to hold. His grey eyes never left the gunman's face. "You think this is about winning or losing," Ethan said evenly. "But it's about right and wrong. And men like you always underestimate one thing. People may be afraid, but fear doesn't last forever." At that moment, voices echoed down the road, headlights multiplying. Pickup trucks, beat-up sedans, townsfolk spilling out, some carrying tools, others flashlights, their faces grim but resolute. Clara was among them, green eyes blazing, and beside her stood Sheriff Donnelly, shotgun in hand, his earlier cowardice burned away by shame. "That's enough," the sheriff barked, stepping forward. "Walker's right. This land's not yours, and this town won't be bought." The leader's cold eyes flicked between the crowd, calculating, but the numbers had shifted. Slowly, he lowered the pistol, sliding it back beneath his jacket with icy composure. "This isn't over," he warned, retreating toward the SUVS. "You've made an enemy, Sergeant." Rick Dalton sputtered, trying to protest, but the leader silenced him with a glare, and soon engines roared as the convoy pulled away into the night, leaving dust and tension hanging heavy. Ethan stood at the center of the yard, chest heaving, knuckles bloodied, Duke panting but unbowed at his side, and as the townsfolk gathered, murmuring among themselves, Clara stepped closer, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "They're not done, Ethan. They'll be back with lawyers, with papers, with more men. But tonight you showed us we don't have to be afraid." Donnelly approached, shoulders squared at last. "We'll back you, Walker. Whatever comes." Ethan looked around at the faces illuminated in flashlight beams, ordinary people who had lived too long under the shadow of intimidation, and he felt the tide shifting, the first spark of resistance catching flame. He knelt, placing a hand on Duke's strong back, and whispered so only the dog could hear, "We're not alone anymore, boy. This fight's bigger than us." Duke licked his hand, eyes gleaming with fierce devotion. That night, as the town dispersed and silence returned, Ethan stood on the porch watching the stars, the weight of the coming battle pressing heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time since stepping off the bus, he felt something stronger than anger. Hope, fragile but real. Yet he knew the war was not over, not by far. The enemy was retreating, but only to regroup. And the final clash would decide not only the fate of his family's land, but the soul of the town itself. Dawn broke over the fields with a pale gold light, the air still heavy from the night before, and Ethan stood at the edge of his porch staring at the farmhouse that had been his family's heart for generations. Duke pressed against his leg, both of them battle-worn but unbroken. And though the townsfolk had rallied to his side, He knew in his bones the fight was not finished. Men like the ones who came in black SUVs did not retreat out of fear. They regrouped, and when they returned, it would be with every weapon their money and power could buy. He spent the morning reinforcing doors, checking the perimeter with the meticulous eye of a soldier, teaching Duke subtle commands of protection, every movement of his hand or shift in his tone carrying meaning. The dog obeyed instantly, their bond sharpened now not only by loyalty, but by the crucible of shared danger. Clara arrived at midday, carrying a basket of food she claimed was for Duke more than you, her green eyes fierce despite the weariness etched into her face. And with her came Sheriff Donnelly, hat in hand, his expression weighted by the knowledge that for too long he had turned away. He set down a folder of documents on the porch, his voice gravelly. Found these in county records. Land transfers, forged signatures, shell companies. They've been bleeding this town dry for years. Your father fought them, Ethan. That's why they forced him out. Ethan opened the folder, scanning deeds and contracts marked with false notaries, and there, among them, was his father's signature crudely imitated, a forgery so sloppy Ethan's hands shook with rage. Clara's voice trembled. Your parents didn't want you to know, not while you were overseas. They thought it would distract you, maybe even get you killed if you tried to come back too soon, but they always planned to fight. They're staying with your aunt upstate. Safe, but waiting. Ethan exhaled slowly, the knot in his chest loosening for the first time since his return, relief mingling with fury. His parents were alive. They had been forced away, but they had not surrendered, and neither would he. By evening, word came through Clara that the developers had called a town meeting at the community hall, a thin disguise for intimidation. Ethan went, Duke trotting beside him like a lion's shadow, and when they entered the hall, whispers rippled through the crowd, neighbors turning, eyes wide at the sight of the Marine and his shepherd striding forward with unshaken resolve. At the front stood the leader with cold blue eyes, flanked by Suits and Rick Dalton puffing up like a coward emboldened by company. Ladies and gentlemen, the leader announced smoothly, progress is inevitable. This land must change hands for the good of all. Sergeant Walker may think his service gives him special rights, but the law is clear. Ethan stepped forward, dropping the folder of forged deeds onto the table with a slap that echoed through the hall. The law is clear, he said, voice hard as steel, and it says forgery is a crime. It says arson is a crime. It says chaining and starving a dog is cruelty. You don't own this town. You've stolen it piece by piece, and you think fear will keep it yours. But fear ends tonight. Gasps rippled through the hall as Donnelly stepped up beside him, shotgun slung across his chest, his voice carrying weight for the first time in years. Walker's right. These men are under investigation starting now. I've already called the State Bureau. The game's up, chaos erupted, the leader's musk cracking as he barked orders to his men, but townsfolk surged forward, not with violence, but with defiance, blocking exits, raising voices, no longer cowed. Rick Dalton tried to slip away, but Duke lunged, cutting him off, teeth bared inches from his trembling belly, and the man froze, hands raised, face pale with terror. Ethan's voice thundered. You chained him. You left him to starve. You thought cruelty was power. Look at him now, Dalton. Look at what loyalty looks like. Dalton whimpered, collapsing into a chair as the crowd jeered. The blue-eyed leader, cornered, tried one last gambit, drawing his pistol again, but this time Ethan was faster. In one fluid motion born from years of combat, he disarmed him, wrenching the weapon free and slamming it onto the table before the entire hall. This isn't Afghanistan, Ethan growled. This is my home, and we don't bow to bullies. Cheers erupted, the hall shaking with newfound courage, and for the first time in years, the townsfolk stood tall. The developers were led out in disgrace, Donnelly calling in state troopers who arrived before midnight to take them into custody, their empire of fear collapsing under the weight of exposure. Later, as the town gathered outside beneath the clear night sky, Clara at his side and Duke sitting proudly with head high, someone asked Ethan what he would do now. He looked out across the fields, the farmhouse silhouetted against the stars, and then down at Duke, whose amber eyes gleamed with a loyalty that had survived chains, hunger, and neglect. "I'll rebuild," he said simply, voice steady but carrying across the crowd. "Not just the farm, but this town. We start by remembering we don't live in fear. We protect what's ours. We protect each other." Applause thundered, neighbors who once avoided his eyes now clapping his back, voices rising in unity. But what shocked them most wasn't the evidence he had uncovered, nor the men he had driven out. It was the simplicity of his response, the calm certainty of a Marine who had seen war yet chose not vengeance but rebuilding, not retreat but leadership. And they realized then that Ethan Walker had not merely come home. He had returned to remind them who they were. When the night grew quiet again, Ethan sat on the porch with Duke's great head resting on his lap, stroking. The dog's fur as fireflies drifted through the fields, and for the first time in years, he felt peace. Not because the fight was over, but because he knew no matter what came next, he and Duke had already won the only battle that mattered, proving that loyalty, justice, and courage still had a place in this world, and that together they could not be broken.